be teaching you, Erin Whittington, my sister, about a poem called The Ruin. It was written by an unknown author from the 8th or 9th century. Historians aren't really sure. It was first published in a 10th century book called the Exeter Book. The Exeter Book was a collection of poems and riddles. The translation I'm using is by R.M. Liuzza. It goes like this. Wondrous is this foundation. The fates have broken and shattered this city. The work of giants crumbles. The roofs are ruined, the towers toppled. Frost in the mortar has broken the gate. Torn and worn and shorn by the storm, eaten through with age. The earth's grasp holds the builders, rotten, forgotten, the hard grip of ground, until 100 generations of men are gone. This wall, rust-stained and moss-covered, has endured one kingdom after another, stood in the storm, steep and tall, then tumbled. The foundation remains, felled by the weather. It fell, grimly ground up, cleverly created, a crust of mud surrounded, put together a swift and subtle system of rings, one of great wisdom wondrously bound the braces together with wires. Bright were the buildings with many bathhouses, noble gables, and a great noise of armies, many a mead hall filled with men's joys, until mighty fate made an end to all that. The slain fell on all sides, plague days came, and death destroyed all the brave swordsmen. The seats of their idols became empty wasteland. The city crumbled, its rebuilders collapsed beside their shrines. So now these courts are empty, and the rich vaults of the vermilion roofs shed their tiles. The ruins toppled to the ground, broken into rubble, where once many a man glad-minded, gold-bright, bedecked in splendor, proud, full of wine, shone in his war gear, gazed on treasure, on silver, on sparkling gems, on wealth, on possessions, on the precious stone, on the bright capital of a broad kingdom. Stone buildings stood, the wide flowing stream threw off its heat. A wall held it all in its bright bosom, where the baths were, hot in its core, a great convenience. They let them gush forth, the hot streams under the great stones, until the circular pool, hot, where the baths were. Then, that is a noble thing. How? The city. So the story, this poem, it's telling the story of people in ancient England, and they're seeing the ruins of a Roman city, and it's capturing, like, for us right now, we don't know what the medieval cities looked like, but we even have, like, all these historical instruments and technology to try to imagine what it would look like. They didn't have that. So this British writer, we don't know who he is, but he's trying to capture the feeling of looking at these ruins and wondering who were these people. And something I find really interesting is they use the word giants in the second line, at least in my translation, the second line. And the giants, the British back then referred to the Romans as giants. Their cities were much more, they had much more infrastructure. They had, if you can go back and read all kinds of books on it, the Romans were a lot more civilized almost than the British. That's civilized isn't the right word, but their cities were much more advanced than a lot of the British cities that came hundreds of years later. So it's been a really long time, and the British are looking back on this, trying to remember what the Romans were like, and their evidence is this city, and it's all ruins. Everything is falling apart. So when they say Romans, they're not actually talking about really large guys and monsters. They're talking about the Romans. That's usually how they do it because the Romans are so legendary. So the city, it's incredible. Most of this poem, it describes parts of the city, the architecture, how the buildings were made, stuff like that. And then it kind of shows you now it's all toppled down, it's tumbling, it's crumbling, it's just really destroyed. But still underneath, you can just see the beauty of it all. So that's kind of cool. I also have a few of these sentences throughout the story. It really points to it was a rich city at some point, the ruins, because during medieval England, many houses they had roofs that were made of dry vegetation, such as palm branches, grass, and straw, for the process called thatching. And the Romans, They didn't have that. They had actual roofs. As you can see in lines, it says, the roofs are ruined, the towers toppled. Frost in the mortar has broken the gate, torn and worn and shorn by the storm, eaten through with age. It makes it sound really like the houses, the buildings were much better built. And that might actually, they might not have been. It might have just been the idea of them is so romanticized that the British are thinking of them as more than they actually were. And I think a lot of this poem is about how nowadays we look back in medieval time in movies like A Knight's Tale, and we're thinking like, this was just the greatest time. We had knights and kings and queens and princesses and dragons and all this stuff. We've romanticized it so much. Well, it's really nothing new, because here you see that in the medieval time, they were actually doing the same thing. They were thinking back on, they were romanticizing the days of the Romans, and the ancient Greeks. A lot of other poems that we've read in my class for a survey of British literature, I think it's a survey, it's probably a survey, in British literature class, we get to learn a lot about different poems where they reference the gods of the Greeks and the Romans. One of them is an example of a poem called Hero and Leander, I believe it's called. And yeah, a lot of those stories, they quote and use gods from Greece and Rome. They romanticize it. So this poem is all about romanticizing the past. So that nowadays, as we read this, we're romanticizing a guy who's romanticizing his ancients. So that's just a really cool thing I've gotten there. So the next bit that I really thought was interesting, they were describing the people and how these individuals for them were alive. They had goals, dreams, loves. They had these intricate lives. They were individuals. They had religions. They had their entire lives. And now they're at this point in this guy's history, in human history, in the medieval age, these people are long since dead. All right? I mean, long since dead. Most of them are forgotten. No one knows these people were. And I know a lot of times we think of ourselves as really important, especially as Americans. It's a character flaw almost. But back then, the medieval people were the same way. They thought of themselves as important. To think these Romans would have thought they were important. And when they died, people don't remember who they are. Even as far back as the medieval ages, they don't remember them as individuals. They remember them as a culture of giants, legendary figures. So that was really cool too. Okay, the most important part of this poem, I think, is that twice in it, near the very middle and at the very end, the words get broken up. All right, in the translation I'm looking at, it so obviously in the center of the page, but then for these lines, it's like even shorter. It's small phrases, like it goes, it fell, ... grimly ground up, ... cleverly created, ... a crust of mud surrounded, ... put together a swift, and then it goes back to it. And it does the same thing at the end. That helps us see and catch the visual appeal of these ruins. Because obviously the poet, I don't know if I said earlier, I hope I did, but the poet is looking at these ruins and he's trying to imagine what they might have once been. And we're getting that mental image when we're reading a poem, and it breaks into little stuff. It causes a little bit of visual difference, helps the reader make it through the poem, keeps it interesting. But as it's just fragmented and the text is broken up, it's like the city is. The city at this point is fragmented and broken up, and it's destroyed. But there's also something beautiful. When you read the words all together, it continues to describe the city, and it's beautiful. There's pieces missing, but you can get the idea, and that's what this poet is seeing in these ruins. And that's a lot of the big parts of this. And you can go line by line, and there's all kinds of stuff. Like they talked about bathhouses, and that's something you would never see today. A lot of people sitting in a bathtub together, and it wasn't exactly a bathtub, but that's just something else. They talked about the plumbing, one of the great things from the Romans. There's just a lot of good stuff in this poem. I think it's a really important poem. And I really like the idea of the British, the medieval British, looking back and seeing all these different things. Like, they would have had no idea who these Romans were. And I mean, they had a small idea from their legends, but they wouldn't know as individuals. And I think that's really what this poem is about. I think that's just about everything I had on this. So I'm now going to open up to you and let you ask any questions you might have.
So do we know where this poem takes place? Okay.
This poem, most historians think it takes place in where in modern England we think of as Bath. You recognize Bath as, in the Canterbury Tales, the wife of Bath. That's where she's from. It's where we think she's from. Well, it's where we think this poem is taking place. It is where she's from, obviously. But that's where we think this poem is taking place. They have gone back and they've found the city, these Roman ruins, and when they trace it back, the location was where the wife of Bath is from, Bath. So yeah. Okay, I would like to ask you actually, now that I've read you this poem and I've gone into some depth about what the poem is about and a lot of interesting things I've found about it, what do you think about the poems? What are your feelings about it?
I think it's really interesting to think about ancient people, like thinking about other ancient people, because it just makes me think of how short human life is.
I think that's exactly right. You're doing a very good job interpreting this poem. I think what the poet was exactly going for, the shortness of human life, the importance of looking back in other cultures. We can learn a lot by looking back on the history of other cultures, and that would probably make the world a lot better of a place, to be honest with you, if we would be more accepting of other cultures and appreciating their history, our history, everyone's history, because at the end of the day, human history isn't just the Anglo-Saxons, the Romans, the Africans, the Asians. It's like we're all on this earth together, and at some point, no one's going to remember what we were. We're going to be ruins, and people are going to be trying to figure out who we were. So I think that is a pretty great answer you gave.
Well, thank you, and I think I'm going to print myself out a copy of that poem just to keep as a reminder of the shortness of the human life.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's probably the biggest part this poet put in here. That and just it's such a cool idea of ancient cultures looking back on other ancient cultures.
Right.
Well, I hope you learned something from this. My professor will be watching, and I hope she has either learned something. Probably not. She did a great job explaining this. Or if not, well, this is my sister. How cool is that? These are some paintings I did in school. It's Roy Rogers and his horse Trigger, and that's the Battle of New Orleans. So that's pretty cool. That's a mannequin with a little hat on. So yeah, I'm kind of weird like that. But okay, so thank you very much. That's what we got.